Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome. I'm Sarah Catton, and I'm the director of the Fair Start mission at Nesta, the UK's innovation agency for social good. The Fair Start mission is one of Nesta's 3 missions, and our goal is to eliminate the disadvantage gap in school readiness in the UK. So I'm very pleased to welcome you to this event today on the two-child limit policy, where we will be exploring the risks that the policy creates for children's development. This event marks the publication of Nesta's latest research into this topic, and the study, which is entitled Lost Opportunities, Parents' Perspective on How the Two-Child Limit Policy is Affecting Their Children's Early Learning and Development, was published last week and is available on the Nesta's website. So this piece of work is really an incredibly rich piece of qualitative research into the lived experiences of families with very young children who are affected by the two-child limit policy. And this piece of work is part of a broader mixed method project on the impact of the two-child limit policy on children's development in the early years. And it is a collaboration between Nesta and the Institute for Fiscal Studies, who are conducting the quantitative part of the research. So today I'm joined by a fantastic lineup of speakers for this event. We are going to start off by hearing about the research that was just published. We're going to have a presentation by Simran Motiani, an analyst in the Fair Start team and one of the authors of the research, alongside Louise Balzaguet and Patricia Lucas, the other 2 authors of the piece. We're then going to hear from Rob Joyce, who is Deputy Director at the Institute for Fiscal Studies. Rob is involved in the quantitative strand of the project. The research is still underway and will be published in the next couple of months, but Rob will say already a few words about the aims and methods that is employed in the quantitative part of the study. After Simran and Rob have spoken about the research, we'll hear from 4 panel speakers, Natalie Vivash, Dr. Kitty Stewart, Dr. Tammy Campbell, and Alison Garnham, who will give a few minutes of reflections on the research. And that will leave us with about 25 minutes for discussion and questions from the audience. So I will invite the audience to join the conversation in the comments box on the right-hand side of your screen and ask any questions throughout the event, which I will then direct to our speakers during the Q&A session. So lastly, I wanted to just remind our audience that closed captions can be accessed via the LinkedIn live stream. And without any further ado, I will now pass on to Simran to kick off her presentation. Thank you.
Hi everyone, thanks Sarah for that intro. So as Sarah said, my name is Simran and today I'm going to be speaking to you about our research with families affected by the two-child limit policy. So I'll start by giving a bit of background on the policy. What exactly is the two-child limit? So under the two-child limit policy, families do not receive additional support via universal credit or tax credits for their 3rd or subsequent children if their children are born after April 6, 2017. So the policy applies across the UK nations and was instituted in 2017 with the rationale that benefit recipients should face the same family planning decisions as those who support themselves solely through work. The policy has a few exceptions, so 6 exceptions to be exact, including if a child was a part of a multiple birth or was conceived non-consensually. So in terms of how many people are affected by the policy, statistics from the DWP tell us that just over 400,000 households are impacted by the two-child limit, with a total of 1.5 million children living in those households. So this means that the policy now reaches more than 1 in 10 children in the UK. In terms of how families are affected financially by the policy, the Child Poverty Action Group estimates that families lose out on up to £3,235 per child per year as of 2023, and that 1.1 million of the 1.5 million children living in affected households are in poverty. In terms of how much it would cost to reverse the policy, the Resolution Foundation estimates that this would cost £2.5 billion in 2024, and that this would rise to £3.6 billion when the policy is fully rolled out in 2035. So, given the far reach of the policy, what do we know about its impacts thus far? The Larger Families Study, a 3-year mixed methods project funded by the Nuffield Foundation, has conducted a large amount of research on this, investigating the impact of both the two-child limit policy and the benefit cap on larger families, so that's families with 3 or more children. Researchers from the project found that the two-child limit has not led to more parents moving into work or an increase in working hours amongst parents in larger families with low predicted earnings. They also found the limit has not had a significant effect on the fertility rate for those likely to be affected by the limit. And finally, the qualitative research from the project found that the limit contributed to financial hardship amongst larger families, in that families were struggling to afford basic necessities and were accumulating debt to survive. Parents in the study thought that this in turn had a negative impact on their mental health. So, if the two-child limit is contributing to families' financial hardship, then these findings beg the question of how the development of children in affected families is impacted by the policy. This is because we know an extensive amount of evidence points to lower family income being associated with poor child development outcomes. So there are 2 models that help to explain the relationship between a family's financial resources and children's development. The first is the investment model. So the investment model posits that parents with a higher family income are more likely to invest more money in goods and services, are more likely to be able to invest more money in goods and services that are beneficial to their children's development. So this might be a healthy diet or extracurricular activities and educational resources. On the other hand, the family stress model posits that parents with a lower family income are more likely to be affected by stress, poor mental health, and relationship conflict, which in turn could reduce the quality of parent-child interactions with a knock-on impact on children's development. So, considering this gap in evidence, we sought to build on the findings of the larger family study by focusing our research on children's early development, adding to what we already know about the financial context of families affected by the two-child limit. As Sarah mentioned, our study is a mixed methods project in collaboration with IFS, and Rob will speak to the quantitative strand later, but the rest of this presentation will focus on the methods and findings of our qualitative research, which explored the experiences of parents affected by the two-child limit when parenting and accessing early learning opportunities for their children. And this included accessing childcare and enriching experiences outside the classroom, as well as preparing their children for school. So to answer our research questions, we conducted semi-structured interviews with 35 parents affected by the two-child limit with a child under 5 who were living across one of 4 locations in England: County Durham, Bristol, Newham, and Birmingham. The sample we had was ethnically diverse. Approximately half were lone parents, and the majority were mothers in paid employment, had 3 children, and lived in social housing. So we analyzed our interviews by way of thematic analysis, and throughout our research, we consulted a group of 3 parents who are all impacted by the policy. This advisory group was convened by the Child Poverty Action Group and helped to ensure our research was conducted sensitively and that our findings were relevant to the lived experiences of parents impacted by the policy. So it's important to note that since the strand of our research is qualitative, it does not lend itself to evaluating the impact of the policy. However, we wanted to understand families' experiences, specifically of the policy. So to best capture this, we asked parents, firstly, their overall thoughts on how the two-child limit had affected their family, also their experiences of their younger children, so the children who they do not receive the child element of universal credit or child tax credits for, specifically when preparing for school and starting school. We also asked them the differences they observed between the early years of their older children and their younger children. And then finally, we asked them the difference it would make if their children, the difference it would make to their family if they receive the child element of universal credit for all their children. So essentially, if the policy was reversed. So now I will delve into our findings. So the overall narrative conveyed by parents in our sample very much echoes that of the findings of the larger family study. Families affected by the two-child limit are experiencing severe financial hardship. Parents told us that the implementation of the two-child limit came at a time during which families with young children were already experiencing a range of constraints on the resources available to them. These included the rising cost of living, reduced local services for children, and huge challenges with the affordability of childcare. Ultimately, parents perceive the limit as an additional, substantial reduction of their resources in an already precarious financial climate, worsening their financial situation when they were most in need of additional support. Parents told us their financial constraints mean they're barely able to afford basic necessities for their family and they're forced to accumulate debt. Some parents told us that they were sacrificing their basic needs, such as skipping meals, so that their children could have their needs met. So take, for example, Beth, a lone parent of 5, who explained that the two-child limit influenced her family's descent into serious financial hardship. She told us, the two-child limit has had a big impact on our family, even down to their diet, like to have fresh fruit, vegetables every day, to give them their 5 a day. It's very expensive. Our shopping bills had to be cut down. They just haven't had as many experiences that I would have liked them to have. It's kind of like we've gone into poverty now. So as mentioned earlier, a main aim of our study was to also understand the experiences of families affected by the limit in accessing early learning opportunities. When we asked parents about the differences between the early years of their older children and their younger children, parents in our sample told us that their younger children have had an early childhood that lacks the same level of early learning opportunities as their older siblings. More specifically, they spoke about their younger children having less time in formal childcare, less access to learning resources, fewer opportunities to take part in enriching activities, and fewer opportunities to socialize with their peers, all due to their family's constrained finances. So, of the early learning opportunities parents mentioned their younger children were losing out on, reduced access to formal childcare was the most commonly mentioned. Parents explained to us that their financial strains forced them to cut childcare expenses for their youngest children. In fact, despite being able to claim back up to 85% of childcare costs through universal credit, many parents could not utilize this option because they either could not afford the remaining costs or could not cope with delays in reimbursement after paying for childcare upfront. As a result, families who needed or preferred to use formal childcare often relied solely on government-funded hours. However, these families often face limitations in accessing suitable and quality formal childcare. For example, there might have been no spaces in their local nursery, or the nursery could not accommodate parents' work schedules. Parents' difficulties with affording childcare or securing suitable childcare places using their free childcare entitlement ultimately meant that many parents in our sample delayed or reduced their younger children's attendance in formal childcare, enrolling them for fewer hours or starting them later compared to their older siblings. And while we can't know if children's reduced hours in formal childcare is due to the financial limitations imposed by the two-child limit, some parents did tell us that if they received the child element of universal credit for their youngest children, they would increase their child care spending to the same levels that they did for their older children. So another commonly mentioned lost opportunity was younger children's diminished access to enriching experiences outside of their classroom. Parents told us their younger children, in comparison to their older siblings, had been less able to take part in extracurricular activities such as sports, music, or arts, go on fun and educational trips such as to outdoor or play-based spaces, and have resources or toys to assist with learning. Ultimately, it was not only disappointing for children that they couldn't access the same level of resources and experiences as their older siblings, but parents also saw this as a lost opportunity for their younger children to have fun, learn crucial life skills, and meet developmental milestones. Many parents saw the two-child limit as related to missed opportunities for their younger children. For instance, Zainab explained that the absence of additional support for her youngest child limited their access to both commonplace and educational early experiences. She said, "Because we haven't got that extra little bit of income, even simple things like going on days out, we're definitely doing that a lot less than we did with the first child, even with the second." It's important to note that parents highlighted that all their children seemed to be at some disadvantage. They were particularly concerned with their children's socio-emotional well-being as they witness the emotional toll of limited finances on their children. They're less able to socialize with their peers due to costs incurred and face stigmatization or bullying. Parents felt that their children's awareness that they were missing out on enjoyable and significant experiences was also having a negative impact on their children's well-being. Nisha told us about the degree to which their children are denied normal social experiences, such as going to a friend's birthday party. She said, because what happens is you get invited and you have to take a gift, isn't it? You can't go empty-handed. Because my oldest son, he obviously wants to go out. He wants to go to the friend's party. I have to explain to him that you can't because we don't have that kind of money. It's a hard decision to make when you want to see your child happy. Another aim of our study was to understand how the two-child limit might be influencing parenting in affected families. Parents describe how the challenge of providing for their children under immense financial pressures caused them constant stress and worry. In fact, some parents felt that their financial pressures had a negative impact on their mental health or had exacerbated pre-existing mental health problems. They were concerned about how their mental health was in turn affecting their ability to parent. Evelyn and a few other parents spoke about how mental health problems such as anxiety can make it harder to effectively handle financial pressures. She said, it impacts on you emotionally that you can't always do what you want to do for your child, and it's harder for me to juggle all the bills and everything else. You just have to really budget. I have anxiety as well, a medical condition, so I'm not always good at budgeting, and that makes it more difficult. Parents thought that the two-child limit subjected them to unnecessary financial stress, making it harder to parent. They also thought that because of the two-child limit, they could not invest in their children's opportunities and futures in the way that they wanted to. This had a cumulatively disempowering effect on parents in our sample, and they ultimately perceived the two-child limit as a hindrance to them realizing their full capabilities, allowing them to be the parent that they wanted to be. Parents also highlighted how the lack of affordability, availability, and suitability of childcare prevented them from working when possible in order to better provide for their children. Overall, when parents were asked for their views on the two-child limit policy, they told us that it is unfair, it punishes children, and it reduces the investment they can make in their children's early development. The two-child limit was felt to be deeply unfair by parents because it denies support to parents who are doing the best they can to provide for their families, but whose children are suffering because their income is insufficient to meet their most basic needs. Millie, a mother of 3 with 1 child affected by the two-child limit, told us, at the end of the day, the people that it affects the most are the children, and it's not their fault. And it just means that we are setting some kids up to be disadvantaged or to have a harder life or not to have the experiences that others do for factors that are way beyond their control or influences. So ultimately, what would additional support via the reversal of the two-child limit mean for families? Parents told us that they would use this additional financial support to not only meet the basic needs for their family, but to also enroll their children in more hours in formal childcare, secure more extracurricular activities, educational trips, learning resources for their children, as well as prepare them for school better. So secure more resources such as uniforms and school shoes. Providing support also for their children who had learning difficulties, and finally, give their children more opportunities to socialize with their peers. So finally, what are our main takeaways? Well, parents in our study affected by the two-child limit told us that their financial challenges mean they have been able to less invest in goods and services that could benefit their children's early development. Parents also reported stress, worry, and poor mental health, which they felt was potentially negatively impacting on their role as a parent. So these findings provide some evidence that the severe financial hardship for families affected by the two-child limit are experiencing could be impacting negatively on children's early development, either via parental stress, as per the family stress model, or via curbed investment in children's development, as per the investment model, or both. These findings are very concerning, as the two-child limit could be acting to widen educational inequalities in the early years, with potential lasting impact, given that we know that children's early developmental outcomes can predict later life outcomes. This also potentially puts the two-child limit policy in direct contradiction with goals of other government policies, such as family hubs, and Start for Life, which aim to reduce health and educational disparities starting from early childhood. I'll now hand over to Rob to speak about the Quant study.
Great, thank you very much, Simran, and we're really delighted to be collaborating on this project, looking at the 2-child limit. And as Sarah said at the start, at the IFS, we're going to be doing some quantitative work to try to isolate the impacts of this policy on certain outcomes. I'm going to say a little bit more about that. I don't have slides because this is something that's coming up rather than something that we've done, but I'll just talk for 5 minutes about the hopes of that work and the context around that. I guess just first of all, by way of introduction, there's no question that this policy is one of the welfare cuts, one of the parts of wider austerity that has some of the sharpest impacts on affected families. Families are losing several thousands of pounds per year, very often relative to what they would have got without this policy, and relative to families with third or subsequent children born just days earlier, in some cases, those born prior to April 2017, which is when this policy started to affect new births. And it's quite likely that this measure, therefore, particularly also given that it affects families with several children, and that's often a financially strained part of the life cycle anyway, poverty rates among that group tend to be relatively high. So it's quite likely that this measure has the single largest impact, if you like, per pound taken away in pushing people below the official income poverty line. Also, not least because every time this affects a family, it's affecting at least 3 children in that family by definition. So it's a lot of people. And you can see that in the figures. The poverty rates for families with 3 or more children have been diverging in very much the wrong direction compared to other families. You can see that in recent years, and that's even though the policy is only, in some ways, only just started to be rolled out. It'll continue to affect. It'll effectively continue to be rolled out for some time as more and more new births are impacted by it, and so that its impact in the figures will continue to grow. But of course, that's largely mechanical. A large cut in income creates a large cut in income. And our interest in this project is to try to trace through some of the ultimate impact of that on families and children's lives. And you've just heard a fairly rich picture of the sorts of pressures and constraints that low-income families and children are under, which I think also pointed towards some of the potential ways that this increase in financial pressure as a result of this particular policy could be affecting the wider development of children. So in the quantitative side of this work, that's really the starting point, if you like, and we want to examine the impact of the reform on school readiness measures, which are assessed by reception class teachers as children start school, and also on the slightly later, the Key Stage 1 test scores of older siblings of children affected by the policy. So essentially, it's possible to do this well because of 2 things. First of all, the cutoff, if you like, the very sharp cutoff in the date of birth, beyond which children are affected by this policy. So because this came in from a particular day for any new births of third or subsequent children in April 2017, there are families that are otherwise identical, but where the third child or subsequent child was just born days apart. And so the basic idea of our approach will be to compare those families and compare the outcomes of the children in those families, like I say, when they start school. And also in the case of the older siblings of those directly impacted at Key Stage 1. So for those of you with a more sort of technical methodological mindset, it'll be a regression discontinuity design, but that's basically a fancy name for using this very sharp cutoff in when the policy started to be applied. It's pretty crucial to have that because, of course, lots of other things have been changing lately to make financial pressures on families greater, and that's an important part of the wider context here. But it can also make isolating the impacts of one policy more difficult. we've just had a cost of living crisis, for example. That would have made things a lot harder for many low-income families, and this policy is on top of that. And we do want to isolate the impact of this specific policy. So we need that, and we have that. That's the first component. And the second thing that allows us, we think, to answer this question well is the linkage, a newly available linkage between administrative education records in the form of the National People Database, and that's what gives us these measures taken at school, and hospital episode statistics, which basically in this context are going to be useful in telling us the birth order of children born to the same mother. They also, as you might guess from the fact that they're hospital episode statistics, they also offer the hope of later looking at some health outcomes as well, which may well also be affected for all sorts of reasons you can imagine, including diet and nutrition, for example. So we hope that in doing all this, we can add to the evidence base on this major and quite unusual policy. And in the wider context, there's growing evidence internationally that well-targeted, well-designed support for children can be highly cost-effective, both in an absolute sense and relative to many other potential uses of public money. And it may even be that some of these programs can even sort of pay for themselves in the long run. And normally when it's claimed that a policy pays for itself, that's very often an exaggeration or somewhat wishful thinking. But in this particular case, it does appear that some of these sorts of programs aimed at children can do that. And, it makes sense that if anything can, these sorts of policies perhaps can, because if they were going to affect the whole of a subsequent life, then that's a long time for them to reap benefits. So among other things, it might mean more tax and less spending, because these people get a better start in life, get a better education, get a better job, and so on. And so cutting spending that supports children's development effectively in this way may be a false economy, or at least may not save as much as you think. Obviously, that's all quite apart from the value that we might all very reasonably place in simply improving people's childhoods, irrespective of this, the more narrow financial calculus. But so that's the wider context, that there is this growing evidence that these sorts of policies can, if they're the right ones, be very effective in that sense and have kind of long-run benefits. But where we get closer to the scientific frontier, as it were, is on precisely how best to support children, exactly what is the right balance and mix of cash transfers, other kinds of services and support. No doubt you want a mix of some kind. But in the UK particularly, I think there's very limited quantitative evidence on either kind of support, but I think especially cash transfers. We saw just a couple of weeks ago, and I'm sure a lot of you saw this, and I think very important work, evidence on the impacts of the Sure Start children's services, which have now been cut back a lot. That was from colleagues of mine at the IFS, showing some really rather positive impacts on that. Perhaps we can now add to that, build on that momentum, if you like, and add to that evidence on the sort of cash transfer side of the equation. And just finally, I think this is part of a wider trend within research, certainly within economics research and within our agenda at the IFS, to really understand the wider and long-term impacts of welfare policies, to look at these things holistically. And that requires partly the right mindset of researchers and the right level of ambition, but also the data to do it. This project is possible because of a certain data linkage which wasn't available until recently. And this is the kind of data linkage that allows you to look holistically at the impacts of a financial policy on various other outcomes. And so the more of that we can get, the better, to make more progress in really understanding how best to design this support, taking into account all of its effects, not just the narrow, direct financial ones. But I think I've taken up my 5 minutes, so I will leave it there. And we look forward to sharing results from this project in due course.
Thank you so much, Simran and Rob. Such an interesting set of reflections and findings, and I'm sure we'll have a chance to dig further into all of this during the discussion and Q&A session. So we're now going to start our panel discussion, and I will take this opportunity again to remind our audience that they're welcome to submit questions for our speakers in the chat. And I'm now going to invite our first panel speaker, Natalie Vivash to share her reflections on the research. Natalie is one of the parents sitting on the parent advisory group that has been advising the researchers throughout this project. So Natalie, thank you, welcome. And,
Thank you. Thank you. So as Sarah said, I'm Natalie and I've been one of the parent advisors. I feel very fortunate to have been given the opportunity to be involved in the study, as this is a subject that I do feel very strongly about. Myself and my partner, we're working parents. We have 3 children. So I've been personally affected by the policy. I also spent 5 years working in a school and have met many children and parents sharing similar experiences. The correlation of the policy and the general cost of living has resulted in families suffering even more as a result. And the findings of the research, along with the many case studies, clearly reflect that the policy impacts a huge amount of people and that there is a real problem. Families, including my own, can often try to mask the effects by skipping meals, using secondhand clothing or items, or not replacing the worn out clothing or items. So that can make it obviously harder, but it obviously shows with the research and the case studies that people are doing the same. There are obviously support networks or groups that can help, such as food banks, community free sites, charity grants, and the council grants as well, but they're not a guaranteed source of help. Applying for them does not mean that families will be accepted or awarded anything. However, the basic cost of living, including food, warmth and clothing, should not be a general day-to-day worry for the families, nor should these services be needed as much as they are. More and more people are relying on them to try and make ends meet. And then there are the school costs, including meals, uniforms, trips, extracurricular activities and parties that children are missing out on, just because there's no obviously anything to cover those apart from sort of the free school meals, but then that has its own criteria, and the pupil premium has its own criteria to sort of meet before the parents or families will be awarded those. Personally, we're not entitled to those because we're working, but they're all costs that will arise at some point. And it's just unfortunate that the children then miss out on those such things. Parents as well as the children are worrying, and this has a huge negative effect on their mental health, especially with older children, when they realise more that parents can't afford things or can't make things happen. I found that with my own children, they won't ask for things that they need or want, as that we might not be able to afford it. And then they just don't say anything. So they are missing out on those sort of things. I do believe the policy needs revising now that costs are ever increasing. When we chose to have our third child, our circumstances in regards to money was better, as I'm sure many families were. But due to the pandemic and the other things, and then the cost of living, this is no longer the case, really. And ultimately, it's the children who are victims of the policy. And that's about it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Natalie. So our next panel speaker is Dr. Kitty Stewart. Kitty is an associate professor of social policy at the London School of Economics and also associate director of the Centre for Analysis of Social Exclusion. Very relatedly, Kitty has recently conducted a study on the impact of the 2-child limit and the benefit cap on larger families. Kitty, thank you.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you to the authors of the report. It's really important research. And the findings are really remarkably consistent with the findings from our own study, which is a qualitative longitudinal study of parents affected by the policy. Time is really short, of course, so there's so many things I'd like to say, but I'm going to try and focus on 3 things that really struck me thinking about this study in the light of our own. So the first one is about the models. The models, so Simran introduced these 2 models which are really widely used in the literature, the investment model and the family stress model, which are used and are very helpful as ways to think about the ways in which living on a low income can affect children and their development. And like this study, we also found lots of evidence in our data for both models. But we also, I think, saw their limitations, and our study made me think that we really need to expand our thinking a bit beyond those two models. Often they come out of the quantitative literature and they're tested in the quantitative literature, and I think a real strength of qualitative work is that it can expand our thinking. We get to hear a bit more about things which aren't necessarily reflected in our data sets, like children's direct experiences. So in particular, I think those models don't really, one thing that struck us is that they don't reflect the direct impact on children themselves of policies like the two-child limit through the stigma and the stress and the misery of missing out on things. This study, the Nesta study, didn't speak to children, and our study didn't either. So it would be great to see more research in the future that speaks directly to children. But I think it comes through really clearly in the parents' accounts. So, for example, in our study, there was one child who was really stressed by school photos day because he didn't like the way his hair looked. His mum cut his hair. He didn't like that. And they couldn't afford, she wanted to take him to the barber before school photos and she just couldn't. And so he didn't want to go to school that day. So that's just one example. It's not exactly the investment model. It's not the family stress model, but it really gives us an insight into just one way in which this can affect children and therefore have a knock-on effect on their ability to engage in school and in social life and so on. So that was one thing I wanted to say, thinking kind of beyond, expanding beyond those models. The second thing that really struck me reading this was the way that this policy has been rolled out against this context, wider context of cuts to services as well that are affecting families. That's something we didn't really focus on. I think partly because we didn't have the same focus on early childhood specifically in our study, but it comes out really strongly here, and I think it's really important. So across the last decade and more, as Rob also mentioned, we've seen the loss of playgroups, Sure Start centres and wider supports. And then we've seen kind of food banks and baby banks and other kinds of charitable provision stepping in. But apart from the drawbacks of those kind of services, they're not reliable, they're stigmatising. They're obviously doing something very different from a Sure Start Children's Centre with a singing group, parenting support, a toy library, and so on. So families at this stage, all families with young children really need somewhere that they can drop in to have a bit of a play and a juice, a biscuit, and even more so, obviously, if things are really tight at home. So that kind of double hit to families with young children, I think, is a really important part of this story, and I think it comes out really well in the study. Finally, reading the report made me think about both the kind of way that the policy reaches affects so many children, current 1.5 million children. So many families are experiencing some impact of this policy. This is a generation of children who aren't able to participate fully. And of course, that's not just the third children, as has been highlighted. All children in the family are experiencing the effects of this, not just the young children. So on the one hand, there's this kind of wide-ranging impact that's affecting a generation of children. And then at the same time, I think it emerges strongly that for some families in particular, there's a really steep, sharp impact, which is pushing some families really into severe hardship. So the study highlights that those not working for one reason or another are particularly affected, also lone parents and those with higher numbers of children. So when families really need support, they're not getting it. In our study, we have families who are affected by the benefit cap as well as the two-child limit. And those families tend to be those who are living in the greatest hardship. Ironically, in some senses, the two-child limit just reduces the bite of the benefit cap on paper. And it means there's less potential gain to cap families from moving into work. But in effect, it really means that families are kind of losing doubly. They're losing the several thousands of pounds through the two-child limit, and then they're being capped on top of that. So those families have really substantial shortfalls in resources. And in many cases, and we saw some families in this study too, an inability to meet really, really basic needs. And obviously the impact on child development in those families is likely to be really particularly severe. And that reminds us that we need to think about the benefit cap too and abolish it. If we abolish the 2-child limit without abolishing the benefit cap, some of the families most in need won't be reached. So to wrap up, congratulations. It's a fantastic report. I hope it's really widely read. And I expect that anyone interested in child development will have the same reaction that I did thinking about this policy, again, even though the material is quite familiar to me, which is what are we thinking with this policy? Thank you. Thanks very much.
Thanks so much, Kitty, for these thoughts, and I'm sure we'll have the time to go back and dig a bit further. So I'm now going to invite Dr. Tammy Campbell to share her reflections for a few minutes. Tammy is Director of Early Years at the Education Policy Institute, EBI. And EBI is an independent evidence-based research institute that aims to promote high-quality education outcomes for young people. Tammy, thank you.
Thanks, Sarah. So we know that children's development can vary wildly in the early years by the time they start school. And to some extent, this is to be expected. Everyone's different, and the school system should be flexible around this and support individuals. But we also know that these differences are not just random or due to factors that are beyond the control of wider policymaking. One of the key factors impacting differences in children's development is family income. And as discussed by Nesta's report and by the speakers so far, this is for reasons including practically being able to buy the basics that children and their parents and carers need, as well as being able to afford enjoyable resources and activities for play and for resultant early learning. And the stress, as mentioned, on parents and carers of not being able to afford even the basics has an enormous impact on physical and mental health. And this plays through directly into parenting and again, then into children's development. So we know that these differences in family resources and children's development in the early years that are caused by differences in income levels and particularly by very low income, we know that they set the scene and the foundations for later development and progress. And the key thing here, as people have said, is that this is within the control of policymakers. As Nesta's report illustrates very clearly, there are policy decisions being made that directly play through into shaping children's development. And all the research shows that there are exceptions and there is a range, but on average, children from low-income families enter school with less developed skills compared to their peers. So this includes skills in communication and socializing and language, which are so key to living and learning in the world and in school. And as has been mentioned by other speakers, as learning and advantage and disadvantage build and accumulate over time, children who are not set up as well from the beginning tend, on average, to attain at lower levels throughout their time at school and beyond. So what we can see here is how deliberate policy decisions to severely limit family income and resources are having a direct impact on children's experiences. And this is both in the short term, as illustrated in Nesta's research and Kitty's research and other research. And this in itself raises key questions about the kind of society we want to be and how we want to treat our younger citizens. And in the long term, it's unwise because, as Rob mentioned, it sets children up to attain lower levels of school and so on, which is presumably not what any joined up government and policy making should be aiming for. And the last point, which I think Kitty already made, it's really important to also consider the other parts of the context in which this is all taking place, which are also touched upon in Nesta's report. So, for example, cuts to other services for families, the current reforms to the funding of preschool, early education and care provision, for example. So these are focusing resources away from low-income families, and they may result, for example, in lower access to early education and care for low-income families. So the totality of effect here seems to be an overall system which increasingly seems to be setting some children up to be disadvantaged before they even start school. Thanks, and I'll pass on to the next speaker.
Thanks very much, Tammy. So I will now invite our last panel speaker, Alison Garnham, to join me here to share her reflections on the research. Alison is the Chief Executive of the Child Poverty Action Group, the UK's leading charity working to prevent child poverty.
Thanks, Sarah, and thanks also so much for allowing us to be involved in this research. It's been a really good experience. So people have mentioned lots of statistics, but just one key one is that, of course, 46% of children affected by this policy with 3 or more children are living in poverty, compared to only 22% who don't have a third child, and that's forecast to rise to over 50%. And of course, the key driver is the 2-child limit. Half of the people affected are single parents, a quarter are single parents with no work requirements, 20% has a disabled child, and 2,500 women have had to disclose that they were a victim of rape in order to gain an exception to the policy. Interestingly, in this Nesta study, parents talked about the lack of transparency and lack of support with that, and they felt brushed off. So even that's not working terribly well. There was also concern by parents that because of the April 27 cutoff, and it means more and more households are affected each year, parents felt that was particularly unfair because it was pretty random who was being affected. And ultimately, I think what this study shows is that this policy affects all children in a family. And we think that, of course, abolishing the 2-child limit, I think we've been quite clear on that for quite a long time, is the most cost-effective way to reduce child poverty at the moment. It would lift 300,000 children out of poverty, and 800,000 would be in less deep poverty as a result. And of course, poverty costs money. It costs 39 billion a year, according to Donald Hirsch, who did the work for us last year. So it's self-evident that investing in children is a more positive approach for the economy. So, I mean, it's no pleasure to say that we've been campaigning against this predicted rise in child poverty for some time. Often people were reluctant to campaign against it because it had public support. And we're not so sort of conceited to think that we've had a massive influence on public opinion. However, we can influence the opinion formers and the public debate. And it's true now that politicians can't avoid being questioned about this policy in the press. And that's partly why we're here discussing it, isn't it? And because the predicted rise in child poverty is now really obvious. I think last year, the public was polled and about 60% said they were in favour of the policy, 22% said it should be abolished, 80% didn't know. But why are they in favour? And I think it's true that in lots of these surveys, the public often hold contradictory views, and it depends on the context in which the question is asked. They also think benefits for families are not generous enough. They also are concerned about inequality. They don't know that 6 in 10 of the families affected are in work. They don't know the policy has a negligible effect on how many children parents have. They don't know that by the time people claim, they've already made a decision about their family size, and it's too late by the time they claim. The policy simply doesn't work in achieving the aims it set out. Instead, what it does is to suggest that ideas of fairness between different groups of parents justifies abandoning fairness towards the affected children. It prevents children, as we've heard, from having their basic needs met and from participating in activities. It stops investment in children, in all children in a family, and causes family stress. It leads to stress for parents, makes it more difficult for them to parent in the way that they would like to. And we know from sort of lots of evidence that there's a causal relationship between low income and poor outcomes for children. It steals away their futures. The other thing that came out of the study that I noticed was difficulty getting access to childcare, which comes out loud and clear in this study. Despite the improvements in universal credit, it's clear that if your finances are so at risk that you face debt and uncertainty, you can't take the risk of incurring charges that may either not be covered by universal credit or not getting the hours you need or being charged extra. I think finally, what I want to say is that this study really reminds us of the dynamic nature of people's lives on benefit. They move in and out of work, relationships break down, and that's more likely because of the stress of poverty and low income. 6 out of 10 are in work, but when you have a child, this time is characterized by relationship insecurity often. It's when domestic violence most frequently happens. It's when parents have to work less and earn less and are more likely to have to claim benefits. The Nesta study talks a lot about these transitions, including when there are unplanned pregnancies. And these events often bring people into contact with the benefit system for the first time. In other words, these events happen at precisely the time when the social security system should be designed to help you. None of us knows when we would have to rely on social security. That's why it's there. And that's why as a nation we support the cost of children in the benefit system. But we seem to have managed to create a dystopian policy that does the precise opposite. It fails to protect children at the most sensitive time in their development. It penalises their siblings and puts parents under intolerable pressure. As Jonathan Bradshaw once said, it's the worst social policy ever. So it's causing child deprivation and it comes at a cost. And ultimately, I think the arguments against it are moral ones and it requires moral leadership. And I think public opinion often follows where policy leads. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Alison. So I'm going to invite all the presenters and panel speakers to join me for a discussion now, Simran and Rob as well. We have now quite a bit of time to discuss, and there are some really interesting questions coming from the audience. So I thought that maybe to kick off the conversation, actually, we could pick up on one of the points that Alison made around childcare, and that's also related to one of the questions in the audience. Simran, you also talked that the fact that those families affected by the 2-child limit were quite limited in their ability to purchase more or to access more formal childcare, and that may have an impact on their child development. I wondered perhaps if we could discuss a little bit more how we're on the cusp of a big extension in the free entitlement to children of working parents from the age of 9 months old. That's planned to be rolled out over the next few years. How do we think this big reform might interact with the 2-child limit policy? Would it, on the one hand, help families affected by the 2-child limit to actually access more childcare, or may it actually exacerbate some of the impacts because it's maybe restricting access to some of these families? So I wondered if maybe Tammy, I think EPI is doing quite a bit of work on early years education, if you wanted to start off, and then we can bring in some other speakers.
Yeah, so I mean, there's a lot of moving parts in this, and so sort of without a crystal ball, we don't want to sort of definitively say, you know, this is going to interact badly and have a negative impact on low-income families and potentially those with more children. But the evidence is sort of pointing towards that being likely to be the case. And really that's because the reforms and the expansion are, as you say, they are channeling money sort of disproportionately to people higher up the income distribution and probably disproportionately to more affluent areas. In no way have they been set up to address current unmet needs, including of the families highlighted in this project. And we know there's a vast sort of amount of unmet need, for example, for children with disabilities and special educational needs in terms of current provision in the early years. We know that low-income families are less likely to currently access early education and care, and they are likely to access it for a shorter time if they do access. And none of this is being addressed. Instead, money is being channeled essentially to better off families and areas. So I think the likelihood is that this will exacerbate the problem.
Thank you. Natalie, actually, the one of the questions from the audience on this point was also for you, and how you felt that whether it would provide sufficient financial relief, essentially, to focus your spending elsewhere to support children.
Hello, sorry, I think I had a bit of a technical thing there. I didn't hear actually what you said there, sorry.
No problem. Just on still the topic of this big childcare expansion.
Yeah.
One of the questions was for you and asked whether you felt that it would provide sufficient financial relief to focus your spending elsewhere to support your children?
Okay, so with childcare, like for the funded childcare, we had trouble finding places for our daughter to go to. So it depends whether the more places will be available to actually access the childcare, the funded places. Like I said, where we were, there was a space where my daughter was free, and at that time obviously she was entitled to her hours, but because the nursery wanted her to stay all day on the days, I would have had to have paid for her lunch or paid for the lunch hour. So that's, although she'd be getting her free childcare, I'd have had to have paid for her lunch, and if that was an everyday occurrence, if I was going to work, that could have got quite costly. Especially if you were added on other days to that, because the other thing is nurseries tend to offer half days, don't they? So, and working days don't often work like that. They're usually full days. So that would be another problem in itself as well. But I think, yeah, I think as well with my older two, so before the the policy came into place, I was able to stay at home or work part-time. So I was able to spend more time with my children, and 9 months seems very young. Obviously, it's up to the parents, but obviously seems quite young to be putting your child into childcare, especially if you want to stay at home and look after them.
Thank you. So there is a next question about the qualitative research done by the Nesta team, by Simran. There is a question from Raj Patel from Understanding Society. What was the thinking behind focusing only on those in social housing?
Thanks, Sarah, and thanks, Raj, for your question. So I'll just explain a little bit about our sampling frame. So our sampling frame was designed to seek maximum variation in family characteristics likely to be affected by the two-child limit policy. So our goal was to have a representative sample, but we wanted to ensure that we were able to hear the perspectives of different groups of families who are likely to be impacted by the policy. And so characteristics we sampled for included housing tenure, location, ethnicity, and employment status. So with housing tenure, we had set recruitment targets for at least 10 parents who were privately renting, and at least 10 parents who are living in social housing, and at least 2 parents who are living in temporary housing. And the rationale behind this is that so parents who are living in social housing and privately rented accommodation have higher poverty rates. And so we wanted to hear from parents experiencing this, but then also we acknowledge that families who are living in temporary housing might be especially vulnerable. So it turned out that majority of our sample was living in social housing, but we heard from families who were privately renting and who were in temporary housing. I hope that answers your question, Raj.
Yeah, thanks, Simran. So we have another question that I think maybe I will address first to Alison and maybe then Kitty. What do the panel think might be a persuasive argument for an incoming government to scrap this policy? I think both, so obviously CPAG and, but also I think the research group that you've been part, Kitty, you've been quite vocal about scrapping the policy. And I was wondering, your thoughts on this question.
Me first? Sorry, I thought it was
Alison. Yeah, I saw you unmuted.
Well, I thought Alison made a really persuasive and strong argument that the main thing we should be saying is that it's morally wrong, and that it would be nice if that could be at least part of the debate, and that we had some politicians who would stand up and say that this is not right. Children are not not getting what they need and are not being able to flourish, and then it's wrong. So we should do something about it just for that reason. Going maybe on top of that, there are some other arguments. So firstly, we know it's not achieving its aims. So our work, we also did quantitative work looking at the impact on employment, which the government says is one of the key things that it wants to encourage, that families should be working if they have 3 or more children. And we know that it's not doing that. It's not leading to increases in parental employment. And I think in the report, some reasons for that come out, that partly this might be to do with mental health impacts, that it makes it much harder for families to cope, and therefore how can you then think about looking for childcare and going out to work. And also often, it hits the kind of financial, the lack of financial support means you have less money for transport, for childcare and the upfront costs of childcare. And so that also makes push employment more out of reach. And the third argument I would go with is that it's expensive. It may be expensive to get rid of it, but it's very, very expensive to keep it, because if you are doing this kind of damage to children and their development, the cost long term, and Alison referred to work that's been done by Donald Hirsch on this, are in the tens of billions of pounds long term in terms of health, the lost money for the exchequer, increased benefits in the future, and so on. So 3 arguments there. It's not doing what it needs, it's costing a lot of money, and it's wrong.
Thanks. Alison, do you want to add anything to this? Oh, I think Alison might be, there might be oh, sorry, Alison, I wasn't sure. I think there was a bit of disconnection.
Okay,
do you
thanks.
add anything?
Yeah, but as Kitty says, it's self-evident that this is something that, as I say, steals away children's futures. It leaves them behind in education, with poorer health, low self-esteem. That's the general impact of child poverty. I think one of our problems is it's become a bit of a political football. The PM reiterated his support for the policy just this weekend, no doubt in order to turn it into an election skirmish of some kind or another, and that probably makes it less likely that Labour will want to come out against it. However, the pressure to commit one way or another is not going to go away, and they will be asked about this repeatedly, and including because certainly in the Labour Party, members won't allow it to be abandoned. One policy in particular I think is really important here. Labour has now committed itself to a child poverty strategy again, and you won't reduce child poverty while one of its key drivers is still in place. I think anyone coming into government who has that ambition will have to look first and foremost at this policy, because it is the key driver of child poverty at the moment.
Thanks, Alison. I wanted to pick up a little bit on some of the points that have been made during the presentation, but also in Tammy's reflections around the sort of impact of this for schools. And in particular, there was a recent piece of research, I think, that described how children with disabilities are particularly or disproportionately affected by the policy. And I wonder, Tammy, I think EPI is doing quite a bit of work on children with special education needs. What sort of pressures do you think this sort of policy may be having also on schools, and also on schools' support for children with special education needs?
Yeah, that's a good point, because there's the wider context again where sort of there's so much unmet need and support for children with special educational needs and disabilities in school, and this has been an ongoing thing that's been going on for years, and we've had various kind of sort of stalling on policy on this, and it's just a growing issue. And this, sort of doing things that are detrimental in the early years again is only going to exacerbate that. And it is going to, going back to sort of the mechanisms we were talking about, sort of health consequences, mental health consequences. We've got this sort of crisis of mental health among young people and children, even very young children, and this will all be feeding into it, and given that we've got the sort of issues with funding, resources, teacher recruitment and retention and so on in schools, sort of, as everyone keeps saying, just sort of as coherent policy making throughout the stages, and because all of these stages feed into one another, it doesn't make sense in the wider context, or coming back to the sort of the narrow sort of perspective, it doesn't make sense as a policy morally, as Kitty and Alison said. And yeah, it may well play out in terms of, I don't want to say creating, because that's a bit too causal, but into feeding into children's needs and unmet needs in school.
Thanks. And I guess so, thinking a little bit about the broader like policy context and the sort of trends like over the last 10, 20 years. Kitty, you've done, and Rob as well at the IFS, you've done a lot of work to sort of describe how the support for families with young children has sort of changed over the last 10, 20 years and under successive governments. So thinking really about support in terms of financial assistance, but also sort of in-kind services. And you've mentioned a bit of this in your reflections. I wondered whether you could just elaborate a little bit more in terms of how the sort of composition of this support has changed over the years, how this particular policy sort of fits within that context. But also, Kitty, you've done some other work on the benefit cap. So maybe if you could say a little bit more about this and how it interacts with the two-child limit.
Sure. Okay. So first of all, on terms of the what's happened to provision for young children. So if we think about, I mean, broadly, we've got services on the one hand, and then cash benefits to families on the other. And both of those, we know, play a really important role in children's development. Families need an adequate income, and they need early education, and they need Sure Start support for families, places to go and play and get parenting support. And what we saw, I mean, to a very potted brief history, is from 97 to 2010, broadly, or at least until the financial crisis, we saw a lot of investment on both of those. So there was a kind of dual strategy. We need to do both of these things. We need to give families early education, and Sure Start was set up, and we invest in cash support for families. And then after, when we moved into the austerity and tried to get the deficit down, both of those essentially took a hit. So I think families with young children took a kind of double hit. They were one of the groups that was really most affected, or the attempts to reduce the deficit and balance the budget. They were a group that really were affected by that. And there was some protection initially for services, I'd say, and family benefits were really cut back quite steadily. But we've also seen services being cut. Then within those services, there's also been a shift in terms of what we're doing with those services for young children. So it's been a real shift, and IFS has really showed this, that away from thinking about two things at once within services, child development and childcare for working families. There's really been much, much less focus and interest really in child development, and much more, all of the money within that kind of pot, which has been shrinking a little bit, but that pot has been shifted towards trying to support working parents in ways that, as Tammy says, is not necessarily helping those at the bottom. Actually, some of it going to higher income families. And maybe we could talk about whether that's being designed as well in the most effective way. But so I think we've seen this kind of double hit for families with young children. Both those things are important. Both of them are suffering. Should I say something about the benefit cap? Yeah. So the benefit cap, sometimes these two policies are mixed up, but the benefit cap is quite distinct, and it affects far fewer families. So it affects something like, 300,000 children. It's still a lot of children, but not the 1.5 million that the two-child limit hits, because it only affects families where nobody is working or no one's earning very much money, working relatively few hours. And it caps the total support that you can receive. And so most of the families that are affected are those that have relatively high housing costs, as well as often a number of children, 2, 3 or more children. And so it's a smaller number of families, but the impact is really severe because they're losing, often they're losing through the 2-child limit, and then they're losing money through the benefit cap as well. And so this group of families really are living in, levels of hardship. In our study, we talked to families experiencing the benefit cap. The level of hardship some families are living in is just really shocking in 2024 in a country like the UK. The kind of housing conditions, and then the very, very restricted, thinking a family of 3 children, living on £65 a week because of the cap. And it's just hard to imagine how that's possible. Really isn't possible. And these policies interact a bit. And so the point I wanted to make was it's really important. Like, if we get rid of the 2-child limit, that's going to affect lots of families and have a really positive effect. But there will still be these families capped by the benefit cap. And if we keep that in place, they will continue to experience those levels of hardship.
Thanks a lot. So we're almost at the end of the event. There is a quick question, I think, for you, Rob, on when can we expect to see some of the quant findings from the IFS? If you want to answer that.
The end of the summer is the aim. I should say as well, I mentioned data earlier. The timeline for this project has almost been entirely determined by getting the data that enables us to do it. So again, kind of highlights the importance of that. But yeah, the aim is that by the end of the summer, we'll have something to share.
Thank you. And I just want to finish with one last question for Natalie. And that's about your experience as being part of the parent advisory group, because I think there are not a lot of projects, I think, that may have a parent advisory group, or at least necessarily say that they do have one. And I think it's really important, so one person was interested in what was done in this project to make you feel empowered and supported enough to take part in the advisory group.
As soon as I heard about the subject of the study, I was interested. I've always disagreed with it, even before I had my 3rd child, because it's always the children that are going to suffer, and obviously I'll totally disagree with anything that includes children suffering. As parent advisors, we had regular meetings. We've always been kept informed on what was been going on. We had input from the start. On things like the original questions for the questionnaire, and which case studies to use, and even down to the pictures that we used. So we've always had input, and the team that we worked with, so Simran and Sophie, have always been very helpful. They've been great. They've always been around when we need them. So yeah, I've always felt like comfortable sharing experiences and things with them.
Great to hear that, Natalie. So I think it's time to wrap up the event. And I have to thank everyone for participating in this discussion and making this event so interesting. A lot of food for thought for us, and I hope everyone in the audience has found it useful as well. So now that we've reached the end of the event, I would just be really grateful if those joining us in the audience could fill in a short survey. The link will be shared in the chat and also available in the event's description. And as a thank you for filling out the survey, you'll be entered in a prize draw to win a £50 bookshop.org voucher. So as we mentioned, we stay tuned because this is only the first chapter of this research project, and the IFS will be publishing the results of their quantitative study in a couple of months. But Nesta's Fair Start mission is also organizing a number of other events around early childhood inequalities. And in particular, on the 8th of May, we have a next event on how different types of disadvantage impact England's preschool children. There will also be an online event a discussion with Professor Edward Meluish from the University of Oxford, and based on a recent report that Nesta has funded that looks at the relationship between different forms of early life disadvantage, and that Ted Meluish has authored. So if you are interested in attending this event, this upcoming event, or any other events and getting news about our work, please sign up for a newsletter and we'll let you know about all the events and publications coming up. Thanks again for listening in, and I hope you enjoyed the event.